I'm talking today about the resurrection of Jesus Christ, undoubtedly the central claim in the New Testament. And I'm going to argue today what I call the minimal facts argument for the resurrection of Jesus. So what I'm going to do is use only historical facts which are allowed, which are recognized as historical by both believers and skeptics. They will concede these facts because they are so well evidenced. Jesus died by crucifixion, and of course that's not evidence for the resurrection, but if he didn't die, he can't be raised. Secondly, I'm watching my words very carefully here. The disciples had experiences that they believed were appearances of the risen Jesus. Thirdly, as a result, they were transformed. I mean, that's to put it mildly. Early in the New Testament, they rejoice when they're beat up for the first time because they were thought worthy to suffer persecution for their Lord Jesus Christ. When someone says, well, how do you know they're willing to die? You can't judge what's in their mind. I'm not judging what's in their mind. I'm judging their actions. And when a person constantly puts themselves in the line of fire, that means they're willing to die. That means dying is a possibility. And of course, when one of them dies for the message and another one dies, they really know it's possible. So the third point is they were transformed totally so that the resurrection was their central preaching point, even to the point of being willing to die for the message. Fourthly, they proclaimed this message very, very early. Critics, in fact, critics who are atheist or agnostic New Testament scholars, they're not Christians. They'll tell you they're not Christians. And yet they think that what I'm going to say next is true. It's the consensus New Testament position, according to scholarship today, that the disciples began preaching the resurrection basically immediately after the cross, within days, or as one critic says, months at most. Now, according to the book of Acts, it was 50 days later. That's about 2 months. So we're right within both critical scholarship today and the time that the book of Acts say the disciples started preaching. And they proclaimed it very early. What I'm getting at is nobody sat around at a powwow. Nobody talked to the critics. Nobody talked to the rah-rah people and got psyched up. And 5 years later, 10 years later, 20 years later, they thought, you know what? It'd be nice to proclaim a resurrection. Nothing like that happened. Jesus dies on the cross. They despaired. They were saddened. Then, boom, after they saw Jesus, just a short time later, the New Testament says over and over again, first day of the week or 3 days later, which takes us to the Sunday of that week, they were proclaiming their central message that Jesus was raised from the dead, and they saw him. That was their chief proclamation. Jesus is raised from the dead, and we saw him very, very early, immediately after the crucifixion. Fifth, James, the brother of Jesus, an unbeliever as far as we know, during Jesus' life before the crucifixion. His brother disbelieved him. But after the crucifixion, Jesus appears to his brother James, and he becomes not just converted to believe in the resurrection, he becomes the pastor of the biggest church in the ancient world, the Church at Jerusalem. So the question is, what got James on board? And the next question, the sixth point, is Paul, the apostle, who was an enemy, a persecutor of the church, who very early in the New Testament accounts held the coats of those who stoned Stephen, a very early, vibrant Christian, that is Stephen. And Paul watches it, and he goes out on a hunt to take men, women, and children and imprison them, and maybe worse. But he was a persecutor, and then he has an experience on the road to Damascus on the way to get more Christians. Paul said he met the risen Jesus. So James and Paul, the fifth and sixth points, James and Paul had experiences that they believed were appearances of the risen Jesus. And because they didn't believe, you can't call them prejudiced. You can't say, well, they were Jesus' disciples. That doesn't work. So these six, Jesus was crucified and dead. Secondly, the disciples had experiences that they believed were appearances of the risen Jesus. Third, Their lives were transformed through the rest of their days by this message, and they put themselves constantly in situations that could have led to their death because of this message. Fourthly, the resurrection was proclaimed very early, right after the preaching of Jesus, followed by his crucifixion, right afterwards. And then two skeptics, 5 and 6, James, a brother of Jesus, and Paul, became believers because they were convinced they saw the risen Jesus. These 6 facts all strongly support the resurrection. Critics admit the 6 facts. Christians, of course, believe the 6 facts. And I think by far the best argument for the 6 is that they show that Jesus Christ was raised from the dead after he was crucified and dead.